I've been a trucker for as long as I can remember, and if you were to ask me the real difference between a sailor and someone like me, it's pretty simple. It all depends on the ocean we navigate. A sailor rides the waves of the sea, but us truckers? We sail the endless highways, our ocean paved in asphalt. That's where the comparison ends. It's all about what you're crossing. I finished high school back in 1980, out in the middle of the Midwest where I grew up on a farm. But farming wasn't what I wanted for my future. So I took a different path, trade school. I learned how to drive big rigs, and the school even lined up a job for me once I graduated. With the money I had saved, life seemed to be falling into place just as I'd hoped. My name is Daniel, and trucking quickly became my passion. Over time, I set aside a portion of my earnings, all with one goal in mind: owning my own rig. That's where the real opportunity is. Whenever I wasn't on the road, I'd pick up local gigs, farm work, short hauls, whatever helped me put more aside. I traveled all over, from the tips of the continental US down into Mexico, even up into Canada, covering nearly every corner of the map during my years on the road. Eventually, the day came when I had saved enough to finally buy my own truck. It wasn't brand new, but it was well-maintained and solid. Growing up on the farm had taught me plenty about keeping machinery running, so I invested most of my savings and bought it outright. I had just enough left over to make a few customizations and gave her a name: Landship. People raised their eyebrows at first, but once I explained the name, they got it. As I continued my long hauls, I made plenty of friends along the way. Other truckers who'd share their wisdom on routes and tips for the road ahead. The life of a long-haul trucker is filled with its own kind of adventure, and I enjoyed every bit of it. I remember one trip in particular where a sudden snowstorm hit while I was heading south. It completely covered the road, forcing me to pull off at a truck stop that had all the essentials: fuel, a diner, and a motel. Normally, I'd stay in the truck, but that freezing weather had other ideas. I booked a room. Later that night, while I was trying to get through a boring TV show, chaos erupted in the room next door. Turns out, some trucker's wife had caught him with another woman. There was shouting, door slamming, and all kinds of ruckus. But I knew the roads would be clear in the morning, so I decided to wait it out. By 5:30 a.m., I was up, had my rig running, and grabbed breakfast at the diner while the truck warmed up. Midway through my meal, the woman from the commotion walked up and sat down next to me. She introduced herself as Julie. I wasn't exactly eager to chat, but I figured it beat talking to myself. Plus, there was something about her, an easy charm. She told me she was trying to make her way back home to Tulsa before winter hit. Julie explained the previous night's uproar, saying it had all been a misunderstanding between the trucker and his wife. She had caught a ride with him 3 days ago, and even though they were in the same room, they hadn't shared a bed. The place had 2 double beds, one for him and one for her. They managed to convince the wife that nothing had happened by showing her the messed up sheets on both beds. No signs of anything suspicious. In the end, Julie had stayed the night, but alone. Eventually, the situation cooled down. She went on to tell me she had been hitchhiking across the country for a few months, and she hoped to be home in a few more weeks. She enjoyed the trucker's view and the break from having to drive herself. Curious about where I was headed, she asked about my route. I told her I was heading south and offered her a seat in my truck. No strings attached. To my surprise, she accepted, and we hit the road together. I knew I'd be picking up a few tricky loads before we reached Tulsa, but I didn't mind. The scenery and her company made it worth it. Julie wasn't much of a burden either. She paid for most of her own meals, and the only real cost I had was the showers we rented every couple of days. We drove together for about 2 weeks, things running smoothly the entire time. We made a quick stop for fuel and food, figuring we'd get back on the road in an hour. Julie excused herself to use the restroom, telling me to head on back to the truck. She'd meet me in a few minutes. I wandered through the store for a bit, then headed back to the Landship. I noticed the curtains on both doors and the windshield were closed, but I didn't think much of it. I climbed in, and Julie told me she was changing. She asked me to go ahead and drive. I barely got the truck back into gear when she stepped out of the sleeper cab, half naked. Okay, this was unexpected. She sat down next to me, calm as ever, and started chatting as if nothing unusual was happening. I wasn't prepared for this. I'd heard stories from other truckers about wives, girlfriends, and hitchhikers doing this sort of thing, but I'd never experienced it firsthand. Julie was already a pretty girl when dressed, but like this, she was stunning. Her blonde hair, that cute little nose, and freckles everywhere. She was more than I could have imagined. We drove for about 2 hours before we found a decent place to pull over, one of those roadside areas for truckers to take a break. The whole time, she stayed next to me, completely comfortable in her skin, acting like nothing out of the ordinary was happening. As soon as we stopped, the curtains were drawn again, and, well, let's just say we spent 2 hours enjoying each other's company. It was the best I'd ever had. What surprised me the most was that nothing had been discussed beforehand. We hadn't planned any of it, it just happened. As we neared Tulsa, I could sense some sadness in her. I felt it too, knowing we'd probably go our separate ways in a couple of days. When the time came, she confessed that she didn't want me to leave her. She didn't want us to part ways. I wasn't sure what to say. I liked her, but I couldn't see a future for us, aside from the physical connection. After a final meal together, we prepared to say goodbye. That's when she dropped the bomb. She told me she thought she was falling in love with me and asked if I really had to leave her behind. I didn't have the words. Finding someone like her again wouldn't happen anytime soon, but at the same time, I knew it might be better to go our separate ways. In the end, I gave her my phone number and told her there was a chance for her to join me as a co-driver. But first, she'd need to attend a 6-month truck driving school to get her commercial driver's license. I promised to come back and pick her up after she completed the program. She agreed and kept in regular contact. A couple of weeks after we parted ways, Julie called with some exciting news. She had enrolled in a driving school and promised to keep me posted with weekly updates. Despite this, our conversations began to stretch into 2-hour calls every other night. We found ourselves talking about everything, from the technical details of driving to load management, and even touching on her experience with school. Julie had a growing curiosity for every part of the job, wanting to understand the industry inside and out. But it wasn't just work on the table, we dived into our personal relationship too, the one that had blossomed during our time on the road. Our talks turned to deeper matters. We shared our goals and spoke about our feelings openly. During one of these discussions, I laid it out clearly. If I was ever going to be with someone, it had to be one-on-one. I made sure she knew I wasn't the kind of man who'd tolerate sharing, especially when it came to physical intimacy. Kissing, touching, there could be no other guy in the picture. I was a one-woman kind of man, and I expected the same level of commitment in return. No room for exceptions. We began mapping out the boundaries of what we could and couldn't accept in a relationship. I even told her about my parents, how they had been together exclusively since they were teenagers. My mom was just 16 when they got married, and my dad was 19. To my surprise, Julie agreed with every word. Then, she shared a bit about her own family, 2 younger brothers and a sister. I opened up more too, talking about my 2 brothers, one older and one younger, and how we were raised on that farm she'd heard so much about. Julie knew my story, but she was a bit vague when it came to her parents. She didn't talk about them much, and I couldn't help but wonder if she wasn't particularly proud of what they did for a living. Still, I knew if we were going to drive together long-term, I'd eventually have to meet them. 5.5 months later, Julie called again. This time, she had even better news. She had earned her commercial driver's license. She asked me to come pick her up, and I told her it'd take about 3 weeks, give or take a day, to get to her, as I was 7 states away at the time. During that call, I mentioned wanting to meet her parents and siblings. She wasn't exactly thrilled with the idea, but she agreed to set up a gathering at her parents' place the first weekend I'd be in town. I arrived 2 days earlier than planned, dropped my trailer off at a truck stop, and drove straight to her house. My early arrival definitely caught her off guard. She lived just outside of Tulsa, in a quiet community. Julie explained that her parents lived about 50 miles away, within the city. Although she seemed a bit unsure, she made the call to her folks and confirmed they were fine with meeting me. With their approval, the plans were set for 3 days later. As we drove toward her parents' place, I couldn't help but notice that we weren't headed for the wrong side of the tracks. Quite the opposite, actually. We rolled into a gated community where homes easily hit six figures. When we pulled up in front of a small mansion, I started to feel a little out of place. Doubts crept in, and I realized I was probably way underdressed for this kind of meeting. To make matters worse, both of her parents were high-powered lawyers, successful enough to run their own business with a few partners. I wasn't sure whether I should go in or bolt like a scared dog. It felt awkward as hell, and I was desperate for a way to handle it. Sensing my hesitation, Julie reassured me. "We're here. It's going to be fine," she said, reminding me that no one was going to bite. She urged me to step out of the car and just be myself. And to my surprise, her parents, despite their wealth and status, were down-to-earth and genuine. They were more concerned about their daughter learning to drive a massive rig across the country than anything else. So, I told them how Julie and I had met, sharing stories from our 4-week trip to Tulsa. We talked about the financial side of owning a truck versus working for someone else, and I emphasized the camaraderie among truckers. I explained how once you make friends on the road, those bonds stick. Most of us look out for each other like family. Sure, there are a few bad apples that give us a bad name, but I assured them that the majority of truckers are decent folks who are just trying to do their jobs and get back to their loved ones. To my relief, the day went better than I'd hoped. I found myself liking her family a lot, and it seemed the feeling was mutual. I proposed paying Julie 30% of the load's earnings, which was more than she'd make working for most companies. The rest would cover things like maintenance, fuel, food, showers, and other expenses related to keeping our landship running. Her dad suggested we put it all in writing, but I only wanted to do it if Julie was okay with it. She told them she trusted me, pointing out that I was the only person she had ever spent more than a few days with while on the road. She assured them I was upfront and honest. Her mom, still cautious, left the decision to me. I decided to go ahead with the arrangement, telling them, "Let's make it official. I've got nothing to hide." We signed a contract that outlined how each load would be split. While I might lose a little in the short term, the benefits of having a team driver far outweighed the costs, especially since we didn't have to stop as often as solo drivers. Over the next 9 months, Julie and I traveled the highways, sometimes stopping off at her parents' place or visiting my family's farm. The landship racked up over 2 million miles, and the wear and tear started showing. Though I was hesitant, I knew it was time for a new rig. The signs were clear, both cosmetically and mechanically. The old girl was getting tired. With my detailed records and savings, I managed to strike a good deal on a brand new Kenworth. Because of my simple lifestyle, I only needed to finance about 25% of the cost. It was around this time that Julie approached me, asking if we could have a private chat. We sat down, and she suggested something that caught me off guard. She wanted to cover half the cost of the new truck and proposed we go 50-50 on all expenses. An equal partnership with no strings attached. I wasn't against the idea, but given that the rig I had my eyes on was around $200,000, I thought it'd be smart to talk things over with her parents. Julie, however, wasn't having it. She made it clear that being of legal age meant she didn't need their approval for decisions like this. I didn't have much choice, so I agreed, but I insisted we put everything in writing to protect us both if she decided to back out later. She wasn't thrilled about the paperwork, but she agreed. During this period, our relationship continued to thrive both on the road and off it. We shared intimate moments as often as we could, and after 9 months of co-driving together, we had been involved for about 15 months in total. I cared for her deeply, and I was pretty sure she felt the same way. Even during times when one of us got sick, we made sure that the loads were still delivered while taking care of each other along the way. By the time we embarked on our first journey in Landship 2, our bond had only deepened. One night, as we made our way toward California, she accidentally let something slip. She mumbled that she loved me as she drifted off to sleep. Hearing those words made me pause. Was this just the natural outcome of our time together, or was there more to it than the business partnership? It got me thinking. We had a 3-day layover before our next load, so I booked a motel room and rented a car for us to explore the nearby area. On the first day, we acted like a couple of carefree teenagers, even getting into some backseat action in the rental car. By the second day, we were lounging by the motel pool, watching kids play in the water while we soaked up the relaxation. At some point, Julie leaned over and asked what I thought about those kids. I told her that I definitely wanted to be a dad one day, but I added that I needed to be sure the woman I married could handle the life of a trucker's wife, despite my love for the road. Her response wasn't what I expected. Out of nowhere, she shoved me right out of my chair, sending me straight into the pool with one swift push. She stormed off back to the room without saying a word, leaving me soaking wet and completely confused. I sat there, baffled, trying to piece together what had just happened. Then it hit me. 2 nights ago, I had heard her whisper that she loved me as she was falling asleep, and now it made sense. Over the past 17 months, Julie had become everything to me, even though I hadn't fully realized it until that moment. I hadn't been with anyone else since meeting her back in South Dakota, not even when she was away in driving school. Determined to make things right, I dried off, headed to our room, and cleaned myself up. Then, without telling her what I was up to, I drove off to find what I needed. 2 hours later, I had it. When I returned to the motel, I found Julie fast asleep, her eyes puffy from crying. Making sure not to wake her, I quietly slipped out and went to the flower shop next to the motel. I bought 6 dozen roses, red, yellow, orange, and purple. The purple ones were especially expensive, but I didn't care. I knew they would be worth it in the end. Back at the room, I carefully plucked the petals from all but the purple roses, scattering them throughout the room in a beautiful display. The purple ones went in a vase, with a note attached that simply read, "To Julie. I know I'm slow to realize things, but it hit me today that we're in love. So I just want to say, I love you." I sat in the front half of the room waiting. A few minutes later, I heard her stirring. She let out a soft gasp as she saw the petals covering the floor and the purple roses waiting for her. As she approached them, I heard her begin to cry again, this time with a different kind of emotion. Then, she turned, spotted me, and before I knew it, we tumbled onto the bed together. Julie was always passionate, but this side of her intensity was something new. We spent the next 6 hours together, and sleep wasn't anywhere on the agenda. When exhaustion finally hit us both, we drifted off. But when we woke, she still had plenty of energy, and we couldn't resist indulging in another intimate moment. I couldn't help but think of the old Jackie Gleason line, "How sweet it is." I had to plan ahead, though. Julie's birthday was coming up in 3 weeks, and I wanted to make sure we'd be back in Tulsa to celebrate with her family. I had some other surprises in mind as well. During the 2 hours I was out of the room, I'd called her parents to arrange everything for a surprise birthday party. I shared a bit about where our relationship was at and asked them to make sure her whole family would be there. We arrived in Landship 2, driving right into their gated community. The sight of a big rig pulling into such an upscale neighborhood must have turned more than a few heads. But we didn't mind. We wanted to make an entrance. When we pulled up to her parents' house around 10 a.m., her entire family was already gathered there. It had been almost a year since we had last spent quality time with them, and I wasn't sure how things would play out. I just hoped it would all go according to plan. The party was a hit, full of joy and excitement. Around 2 p.m., her dad stood up to make a birthday toast. As soon as the cheers died down, I took my chance. I approached Julie, knelt down, and proposed. "Julie, we've been through a lot together in the past 2 years. We've traveled across the country and become partners, both in life and in love," I said, watching her face flush with emotion. "We're already equal partners on Landship 2, so now I'm asking, will you be my life partner and marry me?" Overcome with happiness, she practically tackled me, kissing me over and over. Then, with tear-filled eyes, she looked at me and whispered, "Yes." Even though her parents had already given me their blessing, Julie still sought their approval, and her dad, ever the jokester, teased her about the life of a trucker's wife, saying he'd be there to support them both. But I knew how it would all end, and I couldn't help but smirk. After all the celebration, her dad walked her over to me, emphasizing one last time, "Take care of my little girl." He knew I would. After the proposal, we left with the promise to return once her mom had everything in place for the wedding. We kept in daily contact with her family, even managing to stay connected during stretches where we didn't have cell service. During those times, we made pit stops at truck stops, fueled up, grabbed a quick bite, and always made sure to call her parents. Knowing my folks would want to be part of the big day, we worked out how to get them there, even if it meant covering their expenses. We were determined to have them with us. My dad, being a farmer, didn't have much extra money for things that weren't essential. Trips to town for supplies were about as much of a luxury as they got. Thankfully, Julie and I had already made visits to see them, so they knew her, and they genuinely liked her. It made things a little smoother for everyone. One day, I had a conversation with her dad about a prenuptial agreement. I wanted to make it clear that it was my idea. I didn't want anyone to think I had any interest in their money or property. It was a bit surprising for both her parents, but after discussing it thoroughly, they relaxed. When the time came, I had no problem signing the agreement. I knew in my heart I was doing the right thing, and I was confident Julie felt the same way. We exchanged vows at the church Julie grew up in, with her pastor, who had been part of her life since childhood, officiating. The ceremony was attended by about 200 of her family members, and to my surprise, more than 100 of mine showed up. Our mothers had teamed up to make sure as many of our relatives could attend as possible. What blew me away was that her father paid for everything for my family, even arranging accommodations at a motel nearby, which he rented out just for the event. The reception took place in the ballroom of the motel. I was floored by his generosity, knowing how hard he and his wife had worked for everything they had. Later on, I found out the entire wedding cost over $150,000. He explained that he wanted Julie's wedding to be a once-in-a-lifetime affair and spared no expense to make it happen. I thanked him, and I made it clear that I hoped it would be her one and only wedding too. I was committed to making sure it would last. Time has flown by, and now, almost 5 decades later, Julie and I are celebrating our 49th wedding anniversary. Over the years, we expanded our fleet to 15 trucks, each no more than 5 years old, all proudly displaying the Landship name. Each truck has its own unique fleet number, so even when we trade them in, there's no confusion. Our family has grown, with 7 children and 2 grandchildren, and our team of drivers feels more like an extended family. The latest addition, Landship 34, stands as a symbol of how far we've come and our dedication to the business. Julie and I have slowly stepped back into semi-retirement, handing over the reins of the business to our eldest daughter. She's got her mother's looks and my sense of duty, and she's even designed her own mini rig, which perfectly reflects her passion for the road. It may be built on a Chevy frame, but it carries the same spirit as Landship 2. It's amazing to think how 2 people, both from humble farm backgrounds, could come together and turn their dream into a reality. We've had the joy of traveling through 49 states, exploring much of Canada, and even dipping into Mexico. As we look back on our incredible journey, there's really only one question left. What's next? We're thinking about a 6-month adventure driving around the beautiful islands of Hawaii to finally complete our journey through all 50 states.